The real Billy Elliot.
This time round, we're taking you back to the year that the 70-mile-an-hour speed limit was introduced to the UK roads. The Murder Act of 1965 was abolished, which meant no more death penalty in the UK. The same year, the state funeral of Sir Winston Churchill took place, the Post Office Tower was opened in London, and this band took to the Shea Stadium in New York to play their very first stadium gig.
The year 1965.
Now here's a band, despite only being formed 1 year earlier in 1964 in Los Angeles, The Byrds. They went on to have a number one chart hit in July of 1965 with a Bob Dylan penned song, which was to be Bob Dylan's first ever song to reach number one in the UK. The track, Mr. Tambourine Man. Now, although we can't ignore the American influence of the charts of 1965, it was the UK that was leading the way. For example, a band from Dagenham, who in 1965 went on to have a massive hit with this song, later on to be covered in 1982 by Bow Wow Wow, I Want Candy. Now, 1965 saw the Rolling Stones release the album Out of Their Heads, which produced one of the most iconic songs of the 60s. And this, their fourth number one single, all about the increasing commercialization of the modern world in 1965. Now, there's one city in particular, Liverpool. It was a hotbed of talent and bands and artists that filled the charts right throughout the 60s and beyond. One band in particular put the River Mersey firmly on the international map, and their homage to the people of Liverpool. Who else could it be? Jerry and the Pacemakers. Staying with Liverpool and one of its biggest and most enduring artists, a star that came by chance. While working as a cloakroom attendant at the world-famous Cavern Club, at a gig, a singer handed this young lady a microphone. Her voice, it immediately caught the attention of Brian Epstein and the Beatles. Brian Epstein signed her up immediately as her only female artist of the time. Her name, it came about as a result of a print error in a local newspaper called the Mersey Beat. By then, it was too late, and Cilla Black was born. Back across the pond, the story goes that Brian Poole, whilst on his first ever acid trip, thinking about Western film scores and women, as you do, penned what was to become the Beach Boys' signature song. Despite inspiring the Beatles' parody back in the USSR and getting a plethora of awards, this song was never destined to be number one. Our next 60s legend had two number one hits. This, a trio made up of John Carter, Ken Lewis and Perry Ford. Well, the band, it was formed after Carter, Lewis and the Southerners split a year earlier, which featured a very young Jimmy Page on guitar, which, as I'm sure you'll agree, is a total contrast from the band that we know as the Ivy League. Meanwhile, Londoners Manfred Mann had their eye on the coveted number one slot with another Bob Dylan penned song. The track, If You Gotta Go Now, sadly, it peaked at number two, only to be kept off the number one slot by Manfred Mann's other number one single at the time, Pretty Flamingo. Next up, a band that was described as the first British invasion band to hit America in the 1960s. A band known to their fans simply as DC5. They appeared on the biggest American chat show of the day, The Ed Sullivan Show, no less than 18 times, which eclipsed all of the American invasion bands of the time. DC5, or as you might know them, the Dave Clark 5, they took the title track from the biopic 1965 film Catch Us If You Can to number 5 and spent 11 weeks on the chart in the UK, with 4 of those being in the top 10. Continuing with our look back at 1965, we saw two brothers from Knoxville, Tennessee hit the UK charts for the 5th time with a number 2 that was later on covered in 1976 on the album Let's Stick Together by Brian Ferry. This song went to number 1 on the NME charts in 1965, however, only managed to get to the number 2 position in the UK charts. The song itself was described as a raunchy, pulsating, bluesy thumper. talking about the problems of romance of a teenager in the 1960s. In February 1965, a nervous 19-year-old Cher stepped into the studio to start recording her first solo album entitled All I Really Want to Do on Imperial Records. And at the time, it was produced by then-time husband Sonny Bono. The album itself followed two unsuccessful releases in 1964 under the pseudonyms Bonnie Jo Mason and Sherilyn. Although the album was produced by Sonny and even contains the original Searchers, Needles and Pins hit, which was written by Sonny for Cher, and the Ray Davies' I Go to Sleep, which was later on to become a huge hit for the Pretenders many, many years later. The only single to be released from the album was this one, the title track, All I Really Want to Do. Now the Animals, who had already had acclaim with the 1964 hit House of the Rising Sun, seemingly they could do no wrong. Internally, however, by May 1965, Alan Price had left the band because of personal and musical differences. In then steps Mick Gallagher for a short time until Dave Rowenberry joins just in time to record the track popularised by Nina Simone and their biggest hit of 1965. In this year, 1965, Waiting in the Wings in Muswell Hill, a band who had a few regenerations in its time as the Ray Davies Quartet, the Ramrods, Pete Qualfie Band and the Bow Weevils, and of course the Ravens as well, known now as The Kinks. Now the Kinks are still considered one of the most influential rock bands of the 1960s, and for the next 33 years, their music, it drew from a variety of influences, including R&B, rock and roll, and British music hall. Bit of folk and a bit of country in there as well. Although the band split in 1996, they got together and played one more time at Ray Davies' 50th birthday party in 1997. Back in the day, Motown was the Stock Aitken and Waterman of his day. They produced some of the most globally recognized songs ever made, with already having international success with the iconic number one song Baby Love and two previous consecutive number ones. The pressure was on for Diana Ross and the Supremes to make it a fourth number one in a row. In fact, they managed that. They, in fact, also managed to make it 5 in a row between 1964 and 1965. The song that saw them hit the number one spot again saw them sell 1 million copies in the US and a mere 200,000 here in the UK. Written by Motown's golden team of Holland, Dozier and Holland, Stop in the Name of Love. Our next hit of 1965 comes from a lady with a pretty impressive set of stats, I'll let you know. That might even surprise you. She has recorded over 1,000 songs and written 200 in her career as a singer and a singer-songwriter under the name Al Grant. She was nicknamed the Singing Sweetheart and Britain's Shirley Temple. In her career, she has won a Grammy for the Best Rock and Roll Recording. She's also had the distinction of being the first female solo to win 2 Grammys. Now, would you be surprised if I told you that this talented lady is Petula Clark? Number 17 in our look back at 1965, we stumble across a phenomenon known as Northern Soul, a term that was allegedly coined by a record shop in Soho. Some others say it was journalist Dave Goodwin in the Blues and Soul magazine that coined the genre. The genre itself, officially described as a style of black American soul music with a heavy beat and fast tempo, usually over 100 beats per minute. This in itself spawned its own dance culture, which demanded stamina and endless amounts of energy. Now, when we talk about musical royalty, there is royalty and there is royalty. This king of the music scene has written songs and musical scores for everyone from Nat King Cole to Rod Stewart to Elvis Costello. Also, musical scores for the likes of Casino Royale, Arthur, and Love Hurts, to name but a few. 1965 saw the composer turn singer-songwriter, to quote Austin Powers, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. Burt Bacharach." As we've heard, Liverpool was considered the epicenter of the music industry in the 1960s in the UK. But for me, I'd say it was a toss-up between Liverpool and London and its peripheral counties. This barefooted pop princess from Essex, whose real name was Sandra Ann Goodrich, burst onto the music scene in 1965, which was followed up with several major hits, including 5 top 10 hits until the Eurovision Song Contest came a-calling in 1967, where she scored 47 points and was to be her last number 1 single in the UK. In 2013, Sandra Ann Goodrich, aka Sandy Shaw, officially retired from the music business to concentrate on her new career as a physiotherapist.
Venus must have heard my plea.
This is New Direction Radio with Billy Elliot.